Good morning to Dr. Scott Moore, and good evening for those in India, and warm greetings from India and Chennai Center for China Studies. Great to meet you all in another C3S book conversation. Our today's discussion is on the book China's Next Act: How Sustainability and Technology Are Reshaping China's Rise and the World's Future. From solar panels to synthetic biology, an accessible yet authoritative overview of how climate change, the global COVID-19 pandemic, and emerging technologies are changing China's relationship with the world is detailed in this book. And it also raises questions like what it means for governments, companies, and organizations across the globe. Ever since China began its ascendancy to great power status in the 1980s, observers have focused on its growing economic, military, and diplomatic power. But in recent years, Chinese officials, businesses, and institutions have increased their visibility and influence on every major global issue, from climate change and artificial intelligence to biotechnology and the global COVID-19 pandemic. To ask some pertinent questions, how have these newer issues changed China's relationship with the world? And importantly, how can we prepare for a future increasingly shaped by China? With this brief question, it is my privilege to introduce our author and distinguished speaker of the day, Dr. Scott Moore. He is a director of China programs and strategic initiatives at the Penn Global University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Scott works with faculty members from across the university to design, implement, and highlight innovative, high-impact global research initiatives in areas including sustainability and emerging technology. His interest centers on environmental sustainability, technology, and international relations. To quote, his first book, Subnational Hydropolitics, Conflict, Cooperation, and Institution Building in Shared River Basins, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2018, examines how climate change and other pressures affect the likelihood of conflict over water within countries. Prior to Penn Global, Dr. Moore was a young professional and water resources management specialist at the World Bank Group and Environment, Science and Technology and Health Officer for China at the US Department of State, where he worked extensively on the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. Prior to entering public service, Dr. Moore was Giorgio Refalo Postdoctoral Research Fellow with the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard University. His research and commentary on a wide range of environmental and international affairs issues has appeared in a range of leading scholarly journals and media outlets, including The Nature, the China Quarterly, Foreign Affairs, and the New York Times. He holds a doctoral and master's degrees from the Oxford University and an undergraduate degree from Princeton. With these introduction, I now request Colonel R. Hariharan, formerly MI and distinguished member C3S, to kindly deliver the opening address. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Bala. On behalf of C3S, I welcome Dr. Scott Moore, and thank you for the privilege of giving me this opportunity. This is I see the whole subject from the emerging hybrid warfare perspective. I plead guilty because I am basically a military intelligence guy. I have done 30 years, nothing but that. And whenever as a MI man, I analyze, I look at from naturally from the perspective of us and they, and how the Chinese will use it in a prevailing circumstance or environment. Take for the example, the COVID, which has been very well researched. Everybody has gone to town. But I am amazed, even now, China is enforcing lockdowns, and the whole world has pulled the chain on COVID precautions. It makes me wonder, what is China up to? Not only in this, in many technology, China had this long-term planning. Because it's a monolithic government, it could do that. And it has enlarged its perspective, which democratic countries have not been able to do it. Even the US, in spite of all its the global research talent at its disposal, In some areas, it's still lagging, where China is overtaking. As far as warfare is concerned, I can see. Particularly, I would like Dr. Scott Moore to throw light on this, the use of artificial intelligence, face recognition. These kind of technologies which have emanated from China, with the perspective on controlling the thought. I have been reading about it. We see the Xinjiang, the thought control processes. They are rewriting religious texts. It's a whole range of things they are doing. So I would like him to throw, since he has got very wide knowledge on how it will be applied, because the audience is across the board. They are from many variety of disciplines. And we find internationally, China is also coming up strongly in international bodies. For instance, climate control or environment, on human rights. You'll be surprised how active it is in UN Human Rights Commission. When US quit, actually, it was to the loss of the US. Under Trump, US went out in a huff. So it is slowly capturing all the international bodies. It's a fact. And it is due recognition also of what China has achieved. So these are some of the areas of how we would like a future perspective, because you have written a book about it. I am eager to hear. I am sure our audience will have many questions. I will also have. So kindly give us space and time for that. With that, I hand you over to, I think, Bala.
Thank you, sir.
Take on now.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Scott, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Colonel Hariran. Thank you, Dr. Krishna, and other distinguished guests and affiliates of C3S. Thank you for this invitation. It really is a pleasure for me. One of the messages that I develop in the book is that India is a really crucial country when it comes to the future of China, for reasons that we'll come back to and that I'll explain. And that is a view that I came to because I do have some experience working in India with Indian researchers, scholars, and analysts, but not anything to do with China for the most part. As was mentioned, I previously worked extensively on water resource issues, and it's actually in that context that I have traveled to India, have some experience working on World Bank projects there. And actually what first drew me to Penn was my interest in looking at interstate water sharing issues, particularly in peninsular India, where many of you, I expect, are, and certainly where Chennai is located. And the University of Pennsylvania happens to have one of the best India studies centers, the Center for the Advanced Study of India, as well as an institute, which, if you're not familiar with, forgive a bit of advertising, I hope perhaps that you will have the opportunity to look up, called the University of Pennsylvania Institute for the Advanced Study of India, located in Delhi. That was actually what first led me to Penn. It is nonetheless a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about China from a strategic perspective with an India-based audience and community of scholars and analysts and researchers. And I give this presentation and make these remarks really with an invitation and even a plea for your feedback from your perspective, because it is a set of perspectives that I want to know more about and want to hear more about in terms of how India's strategic studies community thinks about China. I will say that a lot of why I wrote the book is that from an American perspective, we are used to thinking of China as primarily an economic problem, and more recently, a pole mill problem, as we say, or in other words, a political military problem. That is kind of an Americanism, perhaps, for a geopolitical and military and strategic rival, and certainly fits within the general framework of great power competition. However, I think that it's equally important, and in many ways more important, to think of China less as a pole mill and economic problem and more as an ecological and technological problem. And that argument, that view, is something that I came to out of an experience I had early in my career, where I had the opportunity to serve as an academic fellow at the US Department of State. And I had a portfolio called Environment, Science, Technology, and Health, working for our China desk, handling US-China relations. Now, I have to tell you that coming out of graduate school, where specialization is the whole point, the idea of being asked to cover all of those very different, highly technical subject areas. And while I was there, it was everything from climate change was the focus, but it also included response to an Ebola outbreak in West Africa. It involved civil space cooperation, nuclear waste management, a huge array of topics. That seemed somewhere between laughable and downright dangerous to expect one person to cover all of those different areas. But the more I had the experience of working in those areas, and the more that I actually thought about it, the more I felt that that issue area really was becoming the focal point of not just the US-China relationship, but also China's role in the world. I have to say, at the time, we focused very much on, if you think of environment, science, technology, and health, the abbreviation is ESTH. We focused primarily on the E and the H, environment and health. And we saw those issues, and again, particularly climate change and public health cooperation, not just as pillars of the US-China relationship, which even at the time was very strained. Since then, of course, it's gotten considerably worse. But at the time, we saw those issues as the pillars of the US-China relationship, but we also saw US-China cooperation in environment and health as being the main drivers of integrating China into the international system and into the international community as a responsible stakeholder, which was a popular term and concept at the time. In the intervening decade or so since I worked at the State Department, we've seen two big shifts. First of all, we've seen a shift in focus from the E and the H, the environment and health issues, to the S and the T, the science and technology issues, especially things like artificial intelligence, biotechnology. And moreover, that whole set of issues has shifted from being focal points of cooperation to being seen as areas of competition, especially in those emerging technology areas like artificial intelligence. And really, my book was an attempt to explain why that is, why that vision, which seemed so promising and certainly so necessary when you think about the shared global challenges that we all face, climate change, public health, and other areas, why that vision for working with China in those issue areas failed. And the answer that I came up with and advance in the book is that the issues that part of the kind of shift in focus from political, military, and economic issues to ecological and technology issues, part of what that entails is a very, very threatening picture for Beijing. And one of the lessons and themes that I draw on in the book, and I think this gets to some of your questions and comments, Colonel Hariran, is that China in many ways faces the future from a position of weakness rather than strength. China is facing some very, very serious macroeconomic and political challenges, which I can come back to and go into if there's interest. But developments like artificial intelligence and the acceleration of climate change impacts, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic itself, add on to this very disconcerting future additional risks, particularly for the Chinese Communist Party in particular. And it's worth pointing out that if you just sort of step back and look at where China is in its development trajectory, China is presently navigating the threshold between upper middle and high income status on a per capita GDP basis. That transition is one that, first of all, many countries have failed to make. There's a long list of countries whose growth once seemed promising, but then essentially plateaued before they were able to navigate that transition. Sometimes people refer to this plateau as the middle income trap. Now, China is a very different case from most of the countries that experience the middle income trap. So it's not clear that that lesson, that will be China's fate. But nonetheless, it's a perilous transition that requires a lot of things to go right. And in the meantime, perhaps even more threatening for Beijing, very few countries and economies have made that transition without some significant political reform. Often that means democratization, as in the case of Taiwan, South Korea, even Japan. But at the very least, in the case of Singapore, for example, it means an increase in accountability to the citizenry. In other words, what we've seen in terms of the history of this moment in economic development is significant political as well as economic change. And that, of course, has to be extremely disconcerting for the Chinese Communist Party. So when we look at the disruption that's then layered on top of that, by climate change, by public health, by emerging technologies, what you end up with is a very alarming picture for Beijing. And it's perhaps worth just saying another brief word about this with respect to climate change. Some of you may be aware, the entire world is suffering from an intense heat wave this past summer, but China is almost certainly suffering more than anywhere else. China is now approaching its 80th day of an intense summer heat wave that has resulted in temperatures of up to 115 degrees Fahrenheit. I apologize, I should have thought in advance about the Celsius conversion, but which I won't attempt to do on the fly. But nonetheless, extremely hot. Some of the highest temperatures ever recorded in major cities like Chongqing, massive metropolises. And a lot of climate scientists have already concluded that China's heat wave is the most intense on record anywhere in the world, at any point in history that we are aware of in terms of its intensity, its duration, and the area affected. It's already caused economists to reduce growth forecasts for China's GDP this year by about 10% because of the impact on electricity demand in particular. So just to give you some sense that this is a very disconcerting future for Beijing. It's not a particularly promising one. And the response that Beijing has decided to mount in response to these growing risks is to rely ever more heavily on three fundamentally illiberal principles, which are deeply rooted in Chinese political tradition, at least under the People's Republic, but are very problematic from an outside or a foreign perspective, and certainly from an American one. And those three principles are authoritarianism, protectionism, and nationalism. And I developed through the book, how I think those principles shape the development of everything from artificial intelligence in China to indeed China's approach to dealing with climate change and other public good issues. And unfortunately, it's that combination of factors, an obsession with state control, and in particular, Chinese Communist Party control. It's a tendency to rely on a kind of fundamentally autarkic view of economic self-sufficiency, coupled with often discriminatory practices against foreign firms that you've seen an increasing reliance on especially and somewhat ironically during the pandemic period when China's export-dependent economy has suffered quite a bit. Though in fairness, it's in response in part to the U.S.-initiated trade war and other things. And then finally, the rise of nationalism, which I want to just spend a moment on because it's particularly significant, I think, for some of the issues that Colonel Hariran raised. Now, China is not unique in the world in featuring a sort of long-running strain of aggressive nationalism. And it's played a really important role in China's political development all the way throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. The May 4th movement, for those of you who are familiar with modern Chinese history, for example, was a fundamentally nationalist movement, for example. But what is a little bit distinctive about China's approach to nationalism is the extent to which it's been very much cultivated and constructed by the Chinese Communist Party, especially after 1989 and the Tiananmen incident, when the party launched something called the Patriotic Education Campaign, which is a nationwide ideological approach to inculcating a very strident form of nationalism in China's education system, and one that particularly emphasizes China's suffering at the hands of foreign powers. Now, I hasten to add that, I think just from an objective point of view, there is more than a grain of truth to that interpretation. China certainly suffered greatly at the hands of foreign powers. But for our purposes, the important kind of implication of this is that there is a fairly virulent strand of xenophobia that pervades Chinese nationalist discourse, and that we've seen continually surge in recent years, partly in response to things like the COVID-19 pandemic. And even more to the point, during the period of Xi Jinping's rule following his accession to the general secretaryship in 2012, there's been an increasing tendency, even though it started even earlier under Xi's predecessor, Hu Jintao, to rely on this extremely strident and often xenophobic brand of nationalism as a means of strengthening the legitimacy of party rule. Now, the problem, of course, with all of these trends, the increased reliance on authoritarianism, protectionism, and nationalism, is that they've really colored China's views on these increasingly global and increasingly shared challenges, even things like climate change. And I devote a little bit of attention in the book to the rise of a kind of fascinating phenomenon of environmental nationalism, where there's been a kind of sharp increase in Chinese discourse, public discourse around climate change being, kind of essentially a Western conspiracy to keep China down, for example. Also, a lot of similar kind of theorizing around COVID-19. I should perhaps add a brief comment here. As an American, some of you may be thinking about parallels to this sort of conspiracy thinking in the United States. And I should perhaps put a little asterisk to say China is far from the only country or society that's been susceptible to an increase in conspiracy thinking. But the point for our purposes is that it has greatly complicated a collective and collaborative approach to these shared global challenges that we all face. And that's why I devote a lot of attention in the book to the idea of competition, addressing shared global challenges like climate change, like public health, through economic, geopolitical, and even ideological competition, as well as cooperation. And I talk in particular about why I think competition can be a helpful strategy for advancing climate action. It's my belief and interpretation that in order to tackle the climate crisis, which continues to intensify, we need a lot more public investment in basic research and development for clean technologies on the one hand, and also a lot more investment in assistance for adaptation on the other. And as a practical matter, I see the growing kind of belief among policymakers and the kind of political class in both the United States and China that the two countries are in this sort of wide-ranging competition. I see that as a promising direction for arguing for increased investment in both climate mitigation and adaptation. and again, in order to make the sorts of investments and technological breakthroughs that I think we need to really address climate change. On the other hand, a point that I make in the book is that in the United States, at least, and according to my understanding, in India as well, we tend to see technology, and again, particularly things like artificial intelligence, advanced technologies, as areas of competition, especially economic and geopolitical. And while I think that that's certainly true in some senses, we do need a lot more attention being given to cooperation on the regulation of these advanced technologies, which have some really disconcerting implications. I mean, there are lots of promising applications of artificial intelligence and gene editing, but some really disconcerting ones as well. And we can certainly go into more detail about these, but two that I talk about in the book, for example, are the use of artificial intelligence coupled with remote sensing to potentially and conceivably allow the reliable and persistent tracking of, excuse me, ballistic missile submarines, for example, which most countries, including the United States, China, and India, rely on as the kind of foundational second strike capability in the event of a nuclear conflict. That's sort of the foundation of nuclear deterrence. And if artificial intelligence were to be able to be deployed in such a way that it would undermine the credibility of that deterrent, we would sort of be in uncharted territory when it comes to nuclear deterrence and the nuclear peace that thankfully we have been able to maintain since 1945. On the other hand, gene editing has a lot of really promising applications, which I try to focus on in the book, but it's also, I think, worth noting that it also raises the prospect of essentially a whole new generation of biologically engineered weapons that it seems would be potentially amenable to deployment by non-state actors, including terrorist groups. And what this all adds up to is a real need for international cooperation and dialogue, including between the United States and China and India as leading nuclear and biotech powers to develop some rules of the road to regulate these threats and potential risks going forward. I want to just sort of move toward a conclusion by offering honing in on a few things that I think are especially relevant for India. And I have to tell you that one of the more, I thought, poignant critiques that are points of feedback that I received on the book is that it does focus quite intently on the United States and China and doesn't devote as much attention as perhaps it should to India and other major powers and their own relations with China. I accept that criticism. On the other hand, I do try to emphasize throughout the book that I think, while the United States-China relationship is critical and will remain critical as we advance into the 21st century, India's views on China, Brazil's views on China, Mexico's views on China, Nigeria's views on China are going to be the determinant of how the world as a whole responds to China's rise, much less so those of Washington or Berlin or Tokyo or many of the other countries that we presently look to. And that's especially true, I think, when we focus on technology issues. And when it comes to India, there are two in particular that I talk about in the book that I just want to highlight. One is with respect to fifth generation telecommunications, and in particular, the role of Chinese telecom providers like Huawei in developing 5G infrastructure. Now, perhaps you can update me on if there has been any recent change in the government's stance on Huawei involvement in Indian networks. But I quote an anonymous Indian government official as saying something to the effect of, well, we're aware that there are potentially some security concerns arising from allowing Huawei to build 5G networks in India, but their cost advantage is so significant that frankly we don't care. And I think that type of calculation is going to be increasingly tested as I think Beijing will be tempted to overlay its involvement in areas like telecommunications with geopolitical and strategic objectives. So I think how India, the Indian government, the Indian civil society community, the Indian strategic studies community thinks about issues like telecommunications will really shape the global response to China's involvement in technology sectors. Another area that I specifically talk about is data privacy and data governance. This is something that I think is underappreciated at a macro perspective with respect to just how much China's data privacy laws and data privacy regulations are shaping the global approach to the use of data. And it's really where we see protectionism perhaps exert its most pernicious effect. Now, China is not the only country to have really stringent data privacy regulations and rules that impede the export of individual data outside China. But the sheer scale of China's internet user community means that that's really globally significant, both commercially for multinational firms, and in particular American firms like Apple or Microsoft that operate in China, but also for research. And one of the, until fairly recently, one of the most promising areas of US-China economic relations, for example, was in biotechnology, where an increasing number of clinical trials had been taking place in China and the data then being used to seek approval in the United States, for example. That the transfer of data on things like those clinical trials and other research areas is becoming more and more difficult. So we're seeing a potentially significant impact on research in fields like medicine. So I think the extent to which India becomes involved in shaping global data governance with respect to China is really significant and will become much more so going forward. A final thing I wanted to mention, and this is somewhat in contrast or somewhat perhaps in contradiction with my basic framing, that I think we need to think about China less as a pole mill and economic problem and more as an ecological and technological one, is that, and here I'll be particularly interested in Colonel Hariran's view on this. I was really struck, and just had a conversation with a colleague about this yesterday, at how during the Taiwan crisis caused by our U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit there a few weeks ago, the U.S. and India mounted an Arctic warfare exercise within 30 kilometers of the line of control. And this was, I think for someone like myself who has spent a little bit of time in the U.S. diplomatic community, is a very big deal. I don't know whether there was any significance to the timing of it taking place in the midst of the Taiwan crisis. I assume it was planned well in advance of that, but the timing, to my view, was hugely significant. Because what it signals, I think both to Beijing and to the world as a whole, is that if China were to precipitate some type of Taiwan crisis, and it perhaps bears emphasis that that is the single greatest risk at the moment, and certainly the single most dangerous flashpoint when it comes to US-China relations and China's relations with many of its East Asian neighbors, that there is at least the possibility that the U.S.-India kind of putative, perhaps, alliance or alignment on political military issues could perhaps permit that conflict to be broadened and to encompass multiple fronts. I noted that the exercise involved elements of the U.S. 11th Airborne Division, which is based in Alaska and specializes in Arctic and high altitude warfare, and members of the Madras Regiment, which I'm less familiar with in the Indian Army, but I assume has a similar specialty, as well as U.S. Army Special Forces. I think if you are a Chinese military thinker or strategic planner, the prospect of a joint U.S.-Indian incursion into Tibet, particularly one that might involve special forces or kind of capabilities designed to foment some type of dissent within a very restive region has to be extremely disconcerting. And perhaps as a quick link to Colonel Hariran's comment about Xinjiang and the atrocious human rights abuses that have been perpetuated by Beijing there, it's perhaps worth underscoring that while Tibet has sort of been out of the news for the last few years as those atrocious acts have been perpetrated in Xinjiang, it's worth emphasizing that China's occupation of Tibet has been extremely brutal, especially since 2008. And that kind of element of the strategic picture has to look very, very dangerous and worry to Beijing. So to conclude, really, I think where we are from a kind of macro perspective when it comes to China, and the approach I tried to take in the book, is that we are looking at a much more contentious and problematic political, military, economic relationship with China, both between the United States and many other major economies and major powers around the world. Those kind of traditional issue areas, though, the political, military, the geopolitical, and the economic, especially trade and investment, though, are increasingly kind of being matched and arguably counterbalanced in some ways by the rise in importance of ecological issues on one hand, and I would rank climate change and public health as the two most important, but they also include things like biodiversity conservation, ocean conservation, wildlife cooperation on wildlife trafficking, things like that on one hand, and emerging technology issues on the other. And that includes everything from fifth generation telecommunications to artificial intelligence to gene editing, all of which I cover in the book. So increasingly, we're kind of seeing that balance between the more traditional political, military, economic issues and these newer ecological and technological issues, kind of framing China's relationship with the world and its role in the world. Unfortunately, the fact that these newer ecological and technological issues really involve shared challenges and, at least in theory, create a lot of opportunities for cooperation has not meant that, in fact, we see more cooperation. And unfortunately, those older political, military, and economic kind of issues and the tensions that come with them have really framed and impeded responses to these newer issues. So what do we do? And those are really things that I try to get to in the book. I can certainly talk more about them if you wish in Q&A. But again, I think it has to do especially with thinking about how we can tackle shared challenges through this kind of approach of competition as well as cooperation. So I will stop there in order to leave hopefully plenty of time for some questions and some reactions. And I will just thank you once again and for hosting me. And this is what the book looks like in case you're interested. But thank you very much and look forward to your comments and your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Scott, for the illuminating presentation of your book. I now request my colleague, Ms. Shweta, to take in the questions from the chat box for you. Shweta, over to you.
Thank you, sir. So, Dr. Scott, the first question is from Mr. Balasubramanian. His question is, you suggest that China's progress in biotechnology poses challenges to US interests. Are these challenges primarily in the commercial sector, or are there other security-related areas as well?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I think it is both. Biotechnology, one of the other kind of themes or lessons that I draw out in the book is that I think biotechnology really will be the focal point of technological progress and to some degree economic growth in the coming decades. It's a really rapidly developing sector, and actually there's the sort of a phrase you hear from time to time that I do think contains a lot of truth, that a lot of the most important advances in the 19th century were driven by mastering chemistry. Things like artificial fertilizers, for example, that allowed the world to really feed itself. For example, in the 20th century, a lot of the fundamental advantages advances came from mastering physics, with nuclear power and less promisingly nuclear weapons being the best examples. And then in the 21st century, those transformational advances are going to come from mastering biology. And I do think that's what we're seeing with things like gene editing and genetic engineering. The US has historically been in the lead when it comes to biotech. And I think that as a kind of generalization remains true. And so I do think from an American perspective and the perspective of American national interest, it is very important that the United States pursue policies that aim to preserve and enhance the economic competitiveness of its biotech sector. On the other hand, it is also true that advances in biotechnology, and again, gene editing in particular, and synthetic biology do create a lot of fundamentally shared security concerns, again, bioterrorism, biological weapons development, also just unintended consequences of research. And here's where, perhaps Colonel Hariran was alluding to some of these issues, but there's, of course, a vibrant debate over how exactly the COVID-19 pandemic started, and some otherwise very authoritative commentators have argued that originated in a Chinese laboratory and was accidentally released or something. There is at present no hard evidence for any of that, any of those theories. But where the kind of seriousness does come in is that the risk of research, biotech research, resulting in some type of dangerous virus or organism that is then accidentally released onto the world is growing. That risk is real, and it is growing. And so even taking out of the picture deliberate or malicious uses of biotechnology, we face an increasing set of risks that really requires governmental collaboration and probably an international treaty to really deal with. And one of the things I talk about in the book is I think there are some parallels to the kind of infrastructure that's been developed to regulate nuclear weapons and nuclear technology. The main difference being that the things you need for biotechnology are much harder to control. It's a much more democratic technology in many ways. So I think we'll need to kind of perhaps take the regime that's been developed around nuclear nonproliferation as an inspiration, but it won't look exactly the same, and it'll almost certainly have to involve a lot more cooperation between both governments as well as non-state actors, laboratories, universities, even individual researchers, and biotech companies.
Okay, so the next question is also by Mr. Balasubramanian. The question is, advocacy of competition and cooperation with China without alienation is valid for US and other technologically advanced countries. Does that not lead too many other countries to face exploitation by China? What would be your suggestions to them?
Yes, I mean, I think, well, I think the basic answer is yes. Although, I would sort of hasten to point out that it's not a particularly new phenomenon of smaller countries being at risk of exploitation by larger, more powerful countries. I mean, that's sort of probably, when you boil down the history of international relations, that's pretty much what you end up with. so it's not necessarily a new problem. And I think for the most part, I don't mean, it's a massive generalization, but I think it's perhaps slightly kind of disrespectful of a lot of countries to assume that they don't understand that and have ways of dealing with potentially overbearing exploitative major powers. And again, there are examples, and I mean, some countries in Southeast Asia, for example, come to mind, the Pacific Islands, where there does appear to be very questionable exploitative kind of situations going on with respect to China. But I think as a general matter, there is a little more agency than perhaps we automatically give credit to for smaller countries in terms of how they approach their relations with China. Certainly the kind of umbrella dynamic that we see is increasing geopolitical competition between the United States and China, and perhaps even more interestingly, kind of U.S. allied countries. And I think, the Solomon Islands issue is a really good example of this, as is Sri Lanka in some ways, where there is an increasing kind of enthusiasm by other countries to sort of counterbalance cases in their neighborhood where they see Chinese influence increasing, and at least trying to offer a counter to that. And I think if you are a smaller country, that dynamic of having two essentially competing powers, at least two, in your neighborhood is a really useful one, because it allows you to play both powers off each other. And that's certainly something that a lot of countries, smaller countries throughout the developing world, will be familiar with from the Cold War period.
Okay, sir. The next question is by Dr. L.V. Krishnan. Your focus on sustainability is well taken and it's important. The expectation of huge growth in solar and wind power supported by batteries and hydrogen makes unsustainable demand on scarce critical materials. Have you considered a larger role for nuclear power, which is far more sustainable?
Yes, thank you for the question. And I do talk a little bit about rare earth minerals in the book, by way of kind of making the point that I think, and I think we've sort of moved away from this recently, at least in the United States, but there had, prior to a year or two ago, been very much a tendency to say that, well, it's we really have to think about the spread of renewable energy and clean technologies as being an area for cooperation, again, especially between the U.S. and China. I think the rare earth mineral issue and China's control of many stages of the supply chain, at least currently, is a good reason why that faith in cooperation is probably misplaced. And again, protectionism, I think, kind of comes, Beijing's enthusiasm for protectionism kind of comes into play there, in my view. But getting to the substance of your question, I think nuclear does have a really important role to play. And in fact, I think probably the great mistake of humanity when it comes to its approach to climate change was not to build out far more nuclear over the last 40 to 50 years than it did. And certainly there were, good reasons, very catastrophic incidents like that, the ones that took place in Chernobyl and more recently Fukushima. So it's not that there were not concerns, but I think legitimate, kind of concerns and issues with nuclear. Also an extremely expensive technology, of course. Nuclear waste, we still don't really have a solution for that. But nonetheless, I think that was a huge kind of missed opportunity to really do something about emissions. Going forward, nuclear will have a role to play. China has either recently built, planned, or under construction about 30 nuclear plants, by far the most in the world. So it'll play a non-trivial role in China's energy mix, which is the world's largest emitter, is very significant. Beyond that, though, we really kind of need a step change in nuclear technology for it to play an important role going forward. There are a couple of interesting examples of this. Small modular reactors could, within the next decade or so, play an important role in more niche power applications, things like supplying isolated coastal island mountain communities. Over time, those could be integrated into large institutional settings, for example. The kind of second area that I think is promising, though it would be several decades off, would be to look at non-uranium fuel cycles like thorium that are more abundant and, at least in theory, much safer, wouldn't have the proliferation risk that uranium does. Interestingly, China has announced plans to build a thorium reactor. The United States has not had one since 1969. So I think those non-uranium fuel cycles are promising. And of course, the holy grail is fusion, which, if reports are to be believed, has achieved some really significant progress just in the last few years, but still remains probably a few decades from commercialization. But if fusion can be commercialized, that's essentially the closest thing we have to a silver bullet for the world's energy concerns. So certainly nuclear has a huge role to play, but it's going to require some still considerable investment in research and development, which kind of gets back to this one of the kind of arguments I make, which is that we still have a lot of money that needs to be spent to get us out of the climate crisis.
Thank you, sir. The next question is by Shubdeep. China has announced regarding pulling itself out of collaboration with the US with regards to tackling climate change. In your view, what would be the long-term impact of such an incident?
Well, it all depends on how long this kind of ban, so to speak, remains in effect. Technically, it was suspended. Which is particularly notable. U.S.-China climate dialogue was technically suspended, which is notable because several of the other dialogues were canceled. That's obviously a permanent decision, whereas the term suspended implies that it's there's a temporary aspect to it. So it all depends on whether that suspension is short or long. On the one hand, we may see in a matter of weeks that suspension being lifted in order to facilitate some U.S.-China dialogue ahead of the next UN-sponsored climate talks in Egypt in November. On the other hand, China has announced its Party Congress, which also for November, which will presumably offer Xi Jinping an unprecedented third term as Party General Secretary and State President. So it's also very conceivable that that suspension would last at least until after the Party Congress, given political sensitivities. And I think any duration that would mean that this dialogue is suspended beyond the next UN climate conference would have an effect. U.S.-China dialogue remains a really important component of international climate negotiations. It's not as overwhelmingly important as it used to be, but it's still important. And I think it's hard to see really substantive outcomes from the UN climate dialogue if there's not some level of U.S.-China cooperation or collaboration. Also, perhaps bears to be said, there can certainly always be informal talks that don't have to involve, formal diplomatic dialogue. Also, perhaps worth saying that the concrete impact on emissions will probably be quite limited of this suspension. Quite candidly, U.S.-China diplomacy, has only ever had a questionable tangible impact on global emissions. That really depends on domestic action, which is, largely independent of dialogue on the diplomatic level.
Yes, sir. The next question is by Mr. Balasubramanian. The question is, net zero carbon emissions sounds attractive. Many agencies are engaged in developing the requested technology. The expectation of CCUS technology to suit all emitting countries is unrealistic as of now. Some may not have suitable locations for sequestration. How do you see the future under these circumstances?
CCUS is probably the other thing, other than, along with nuclear, that I think was a real missed opportunity for investment in research and development over the last few decades. From a commercial perspective, the attraction of CCUS is dependent on there being a price on carbon. So really, until we have probably some type of global market for carbon, it will not remain a commercially attractive technology in most cases. And as you point out, not every country would have a suitable geology for it. But I think as a relatively well understood means of ensuring that emissions from coal plants and other things don't contribute to climate change, it's a potentially really important technology, and probably would have been the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions over the last few decades. So it's a bit of a missed opportunity, unfortunately, and I do think deserves further research and development. At the moment, the main use case is in enhanced oil recovery. You use the carbon to actually help push out oil, which is obviously a little bit paradoxical to be sequestering carbon for the purpose of extracting fossil fuels to then burn. So that's still kind of a paradox that needs to be resolved through some further research and development, but potentially an important technology.
The next question is by Sapna. The question is, it is pleasing to hear of the need for balancing legitimate concerns about China's action while maintaining openness and innovation that would enable competitive advantage. Are there any examples to go by that this is practicable?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the main way that I kind of talk about it in the book is the extent to which a lot of knowledge. Well, first of all, that knowledge production, especially in academic research, is really a public good in the sense that it benefits all countries. But China, just because of the size of its population, the fact that it has long been a relatively well-educated country, and a country that's invested a lot in particularly science and technology, has played a really, really important role in knowledge production across a lot of different fields. Biotechnology is a good example. But having said that, the U.S. really gains more than China does from this knowledge production and knowledge sharing. And I think you do see a lot of different examples of that. Actually, I mean, one that mentioned in the book is the development of the first generation of mRNA COVID vaccines, which built on work done by a Chinese postdoc working in a U.S. research lab in the mid-2000s on stabilization. No, sorry, not the mid-2000s. It was later on the stabilization of coronavirus spike proteins. And that was really the foundation of the mRNA vaccine, the approach to developing the mRNA vaccines. And so that, would not have been possible had there not been a large-scale flow of extremely talented Chinese researchers and students and scientists then joining their American counterparts and counterparts from all over the world, including India, in developing these vaccines. And you can find a lot of similar examples of that in individual technology areas. Artificial intelligence, also the U.S. AI depends to an outsized degree on on foreign-born researchers, for example, especially those originating from China as well as India to some degree. So there are lots of examples of that kind of co-production and knowledge transfer. And in some ways, I mean, your question is making me think the perhaps most striking thing is the relatively few examples, like good counterexamples of cases in which the United States or some other country is able to develop a technology independently and without the participation and involvement of foreign scientists and researchers.
Thank you, sir. The next question is by Sapna. The question is, minimization of our energy consumption is a key contributor to sustainability. Excessive dependence on technology increases demand for energy and upsets sustainability. What are your views on it?
Sorry, could you repeat the question, Sweta?
Yeah, sure, sir. I'll read the question again. Minimization of our energy consumption is a key contributor to sustainability. Excessive dependence on technology increases demand for energy and upsets sustainability. What are your views on it?
Got it. Yeah, that's true. That being said, I mean, there are lots of drivers of particularly greenhouse gas emissions, of which kind of electronics and data centers and things like that play an important but only partial role. One big contributor is land use change, and actually one of the kind of really concerning things about climate change in general is what are called nonlinear effects, and these are things like as you get increased warming in the Arctic, you get the thawing of permafrost soil, which contains high levels of methane, which is an even more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So that the concentrations of methane increase in the atmosphere and drive warming still further. So you get a sort of vicious cycle. So it's not all about. In other words, there are ways to make a lot of progress on climate change and cutting emissions that don't necessarily involve these trade-offs between technology, and emissions. But the question is certainly correct in asserting that there is a relationship, and to some degree, our challenge is in becoming a more technologically sophisticated economy and society globally, while finding new sources of energy in order to power that. That's certainly a big bedrock part of the problem. And I mean, another aspect perhaps of the question is what's sometimes called energy access. And this is really important when we come to thinking about climate change, where an essential part of poverty reduction and human development is having access to electricity. For connectivity, so you have your phone, for health, for education, all of these things require electricity and require access to energy. It's unfortunately still true that in a lot of parts of the world, the cheapest sources of energy are fossil fuels. So again, investing more in research and development to make cleaner technologies cheaper, so that they can meet energy access and poverty reduction goals as well as decarbonization goals is really critical.
Thank you, sir. The next question is by Shivdeep. In your sense, by when China in commercial form can wirelessly transmit solar power from outer space to Earth? If it can, then what could be its environmental impact?
Yeah, I mean, that remains a pretty speculative technology. People have, kind of theorized about it. It's unclear how that would work at a, both a technical and a commercial level. I mean, look, it's conceivably a solution to the world's energy crisis, but I feel pretty confident in saying we'll get fusion to work before we get, to that particular way of getting enough clean energy.
The next is a comment by L.V. Krishnan, sir. He says that the danger of nuclear radiation or nuclear waste is exaggerated in comparison to catastrophic climate change effects. US decision to store away spent nuclear fuel as such is unfortunate, as reprocessing and turning the nuclear waste into glass blocks provides adequate safety. Do you want to comment on it, sir?
Well, I would just thank Dr. Krishnan for that comment. I mean, I certainly defer to his expertise on that topic. I can't say that I know a lot about it, but I that's a very interesting and important view, and I think certainly it strikes me as a plausible argument that the catastrophic risks of climate change perhaps outweigh the dangers posed by nuclear waste. I think that's a seems like a compelling argument.
Thank you, sir. The next question is by Shweta. Can we take for granted China's willingness for cooperation of the kind you have envisioned? Is there any evidence, at least in selected areas, that China really believes that both sides, US and China, can gain by such cooperation?
So, I mean, the short answer is yes, but the longer answer is perhaps, yes, but only marginally. I mean, I think, climate change is the two examples that I'll talk about that I do mention in the book are climate change and health. So I think the climate change area, it's actually sort of arguable the extent to which US-China cooperation has really generated a lot of tangible benefits. I think what you can say is that without US-China diplomatic cooperation, you wouldn't have been able to get the Paris Agreement framework through. And that has, sort of formed the foundation of the world's climate response. Then again, the counter argument to that, I think, would be, well, but the world is not currently on track to meet its Paris Agreement goals. So perhaps a debatable point there. I think when it comes to public health, the argument for some type of the value of U.S.-China cooperation is stronger, though as a practical political matter, there's not a lot of hope for that in the near future, and I do talk about that in the book. But something that's worth reflecting on when it comes to COVID, and I go into this in some detail in the book, is that I mean the virus that causes COVID-19 is literally SARS-CoV-2. So named because it's so similar to SARS-CoV-1, which is the virus that caused the SARS epidemic in 2003. And both of these new coronaviruses originated, at least as far as we know, in a very small part of southern China. And I think it's an interesting question to ask, why this apparent coincidence? And it turns out, and this is the argument that I make in the book, is that southern China has several kind of economic, ecological, and geographic factors that combine to make it a particularly good place for new viral diseases to incubate and jump from animal to human hosts. But even more important than that, that's not unique. There are other parts of the world that fit that description, including parts of South Asia. But what's really unique about southern China is how well connected it is to the rest of the world, the number of direct flights from Hong Kong and Guangzhou. So if you have a new kind of virus that originates in southern China, it gets spread to the rest of the world very, very quickly. And I think that's the distinguishing, kind of feature of China from a public health perspective. And that means that from the standpoint of preventing the next pandemic, some type of cooperation with China on epidemic surveillance and prevention is really essential. There's an incredibly strong rationale for that. And in fact, there's what's become a really politically contentious example of U.S.-China cooperation. But there was a U.S. government grant that was kind of subcontracted. I mean, it's a kind of convoluted legal structure, but indirectly went to support Chinese scientists doing research on the origins of SARS-CoV-1, the virus that caused the SARS outbreak. And eventually, they were able to locate what's pretty convincingly thought to be the origin of SARS-CoV-1 in bat populations in southwestern China, which is a valuable finding because it allows us to sort of guess how SARS-CoV-2 originated, and therefore how future pandemic viruses might originate. But that particular cooperation has become really politically contentious in the United States. And in fact, the US government revoked that particular funding source because it was seen as, supporting potentially problematic actors within China. So the case for that type of cooperation is really strong, but from a practical or political standpoint, not very likely given current tensions.
Due to time constraints, we'll be taking one last question. So the last question is by Raghav Selvaraj. The question is, standardization in governments are viewed as ways of controlling newer technologies and limiting any negative effects they might have on our society. Usually, Brussels is seen as leader in this space, effectively using Brussels effect. Where do you see India or US in this space of policy innovation in taming the negative externalities of latest technologies in relations to countering what is seen as China's continuous and unbridled march in these technological areas?
Well, I think from a US perspective, there's an increasing desire to expand cooperation on emerging technologies with perceived, partners and allies. Up till now, the main focus of that has been with European countries and Japan to some degree. I think there's a strong case for expanding that type of dialogue and cooperation with India as well. Though, and this is a point I make in the book, I think when it comes to particularly the US and India cooperating on emerging technology issues, particularly regulation and standard setting, is easier said than done. It's my perception, though perhaps some of you would disagree, that there do remain quite different views on how emerging technologies should be regulated. And I mean, again, I think 5G technology is an example of where there's a different perception of particularly security risks, for example, that would really complicate that type of dialogue. But I do think it's really important. The other thing that I think is important, which I emphasize in the book, is that the regulation and standard setting of emerging technologies not be seen purely as a government-to-government exercise. That's important. And ultimately, you do need the involvement of governments to set international agreements. But the nature of these technologies is such that governments are often behind when it comes to how fast the technologies are developing. And as a result, you also need cooperation and dialogue and rule setting among non-state and sub-state actors, universities, companies, individual researchers. And I think that's where in the near term, there's even more potential than at the governmental level for US-India engagement and dialogue.
I think we have come to the end of the Q&A session. Thank you, Sapna, for handling. Thank you, Shweta, for handling the Q&A. And thank you very much, sir.
I have a few points he has raised.
Please, sir.
I will touch upon these. I think Dr. Scott Moore has raised two issues. One regarding the what do you call the 5G technology. Huawei, what is India's stand? I think it is actually a dynamic one, the question, because I doubt very much whether US itself is clear. And on this, because the inextricably technology is mixed with warfare. This the dynamics of it. So particularly the information technology laws of China make it compulsory to share data with the government, which doesn't exist in democratic countries. There's a lot more privacy, and privacy is better guarded. So I think it's a dynamic process. And data governance, I fully agree with you that there should be greater cooperation between within the world, because it is India has emerged as one of the biggest data generators by the sheer numbers. But my problem is India, China, Russia, Brazil, you can say South Africa, they all feel that the existing world order is not fair to them. That is how the BRICS has come. Unless this question is answered, I don't think it will be peripheral, all this talk of cooperation. I can give you the example of vaccine imperialism. My grandson had to come from Italy. He had to have 4 vaccines, 4 vaccinations to overcome this. It is absolutely ridiculous. AstraZeneca, which is manufactured in UK, is accepted in European Union. When it is manufactured in India, it is not accepted. This is the reason why we should sort out the world order. Unless this is done, I fear all cooperation between countries will get bogged down. We can see it in various issues. The Iran nuclear issue, where an agreement was in force, or the Palestine agreement, for which both the protagonists were awarded the Nobel Prize, all bogged down because of this. Because I am sorry to say, since you are American speaker, the inherent American exceptionalism is guiding the world. Still, when the world is no more, prepared to listen. You might have a different view, but Ukraine war is very good example. Our external affairs minister mentioned this, that why we should get upset about a war in Europe when nobody is upset when China is getting ready to fight with India. So I think there is a rationale for a different world order. Then only we can sort of corral China into making reasonable demands internationally, or other powers, emerging powers. This is my view. I don't represent anybody. And lastly, I think even on the climate cooperation, there is a lot to be done by the what you call so-called advanced countries, who per capita consumption is sky high. I can't understand why should empty railway stations should be warmed round the clock in winter, and guys, just because they are guilty of living elsewhere, they should be penalized for that. And last point I want to make is about this exercise with the Arctic Division in Ladakh. Recently we had. I think this has got 2 parts. One is it sends a signal that US and India are on the same page when it comes to a confrontation, land-based confrontation with because India is the only country sharing a huge land border, that they are on the same page. And on the other hand, it also answers India's grievance that many doubt whether US will come to actually intervene in any confrontation with China. There is a great doubt, because in Pakistan we have seen how US intervention has encouraged Pakistan. This is our historical experience. So I think it sends a signal also for that, to sort of satisfy, though in a small extent. But US had been exercising US troops, I have seen for a long time. And but India exercises with 33 other countries, just as US does. US also does this. Big powers do this, though India may not be on the same big power scale. It is the fourth or fifth in the world as US. India does this, and it is going to stand in good stead in the Indian Ocean region, which is becoming more centric to the Indo-Pacific. Thank you. From the wide range of questions raised, you can see how absorbing your talk had been, thought-provoking, and it is encouraging me to buy your book and read it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Answering all questions patiently.
Thank you, Colonel Hari sir, for the intervention. I now request Ms. Shweta to formally give the vote of thanks. Over to you, Shweta.
Thank you, sir. On behalf of the entire team of Chennai Center for China Studies, I take immense pleasure in proposing the vote of thanks. Firstly, I would like to thank Dr. Scott Moore for taking time away from his busy schedule and also having this interesting discussion on his book with us today. And also a big thank you to you, sir, for patiently answering all the questions posted by the participants. And we look forward to having many such future engagements with you. I express my sincere thanks to the Director General of C3S, Commodore R.S. Vasan, sir, for his unwavering support and guidance to the team of C3S in all our endeavors. A big thank you to all the distinguished members and all the other participants who joined us today and posted their questions and made the session interesting. Last but not the least, I extend my thanks to my colleagues, Mr. Balasubramanian sir, Ms. Sapna, Shubdeep Mandal, and Madhumita and Dunya for their support and coordination. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Colonel Hari sir. Thank you, Dr. Scott Moore. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
See you.